Welcome back to Chapter 13. In this video, we're going to talk about the board crush, or the futures trades that you would use if you were trying to hedge the business of a soybean crusher. So remember, a hedger will always do the same thing in the futures market that they do in the cash market in order to hedge themselves. So a soybean crusher is in the business of buying soybeans in the cash market and selling meal and oil in the cash market. So their futures hedge will involve buying soybean futures and selling meal and oil futures. Notice that this futures position is going to make money only if they're losing money in the cash market. So think about when they would be losing money in the cash market. If they're having to buy increasingly expensive soybeans, if the price of soybeans is going up, but the price of meal and oil is not going up, their profits are going to be squeezed, right? So they're losing money in the cash market. But if they've also bought soybean futures and sold meal and oil futures, that same rising of soybean prices will be making them money on the futures spread. Now the tricky thing about hedging this business is that to get your hedge spread right, you need to buy soybeans and sell oil and meal in the right proportions to mimic the business of crushing soybeans. So, going back to the proportions, remember that 1 bushel of soybeans equals roughly 11 pounds of oil and 44 pounds of meal. So, it turns out that there's two versions of the spread that are kind of widely followed by the trade, and one is the 1-1-1 spread, because it's super easy to remember, and the other is the 9-11-10 spread. Now, the 9-11-10 spread means 9 contracts oil, 11 contracts meal, and 10 contracts soybeans. And that gets you a better proportion of coverage than the 1-1-1 spread does. But the 9-11-10 is more complicated to implement, and if you are speculating and not a hedger, then particularly if your broker is charging you commission on every single futures contract you trade, then the commission charge would be very high on that kind of spread. So smaller players tend to play this spread with a 1-1-1 spread. So let's talk about what I mean by getting the proportions right. For a second, we're going to focus on the 1-1-1 spread. And in the example I've got here, I've got two different examples. So I've got here, we're going to buy 1 contract soybean oil, buy 1 contract soybean meal, sell 1 contract soybeans. So notice that this is the opposite of what a soybean crusher would use to hedge. But this is a trade that a speculator might use, especially if they want to speculate that the profit of soybean crushers are going to go up. So notice this makes money if the price of soybeans goes down, or if oil and meal price goes up. So if you're just a trader and you want to speculate that the soybean crushing profits will go up, this is the trade for you. And the opposite, which is what a hedger would naturally do, or someone who wants to speculate that crushing profits will go down, would place this trade. But let's see how the proportions come out. So you can go check the contract specifications for yourself, but it turns out that the futures contract for soybean oil is specified to 60,000 pounds of soybean oil. The soybean meal contract is 100 short tons, or 200,000 pounds. And the soybean contract we're probably familiar with by now is for 5,000 bushels. So if we take our 5,000 bushels, so suppose we're going to crush 1 futures contract worth of soybeans. How much meal and oil would that produce? Well, at 11 pounds of soybean oil per bushel, we would get 55,000 pounds of soybean oil. That doesn't match the 60,000 pounds here. So 1 contract of soybeans, if you crush it, you get 55,000 pounds of soybean oil. If you hedged that with 1 contract of soybean oil, you would be overhedged by 5,000 pounds of soybean oil. Similarly, if you crush 1 contract's worth of soybeans, you're going to get 220,000 pounds of soybean meal. And suppose that you want to hedge that with 1 soybean meal contract. Well, you're producing 220,000, you've only hedged 200,000, so you are underhedged in soybean meal by 20,000 pounds. So clearly that's not good to be under and overhedged in the output markets. But there is a trade-off to being more precise in that you have to use a higher number of contracts. So if you do the math problem and figure out what are the lowest number of contracts that you would have to buy to get these proportions pretty close, you would come up with 9 contracts of soybean oil, 11 contracts of soybean meal, and 10 contracts of soybeans to hedge the gross processing margin. So let's take a look at what that means. So in this case, the smallest multiple of the hedge that we can do is for 10 contracts of soybeans, so let's go with that. If we crush 10 contracts worth of soybeans, that's going to be 5,000 times 10, and that would give us 550,000 pounds of soybean oil, and 5,000 times 10 times 44, it would give us 2,200,000 pounds of soybean meal. Now, if we went and hedged that with 9 and 11 futures contracts for oil and meal, respectively, we would be hedged for 540,000 pounds of soybean oil. Notice that's pretty close. And we would be right on the money for soybean meal. So in this case, we are perfectly hedged in soybean meal, and we are only 10,000 pounds under hedged in soybean oil. And that's more quantity than we were hedged before, than we were under hedged before in the 1-1-1 spread, but we're talking about a much larger base. That was for 5,000 bushels of soybeans and not 50,000 bushels of soybeans. So proportionally, it gets much closer to being a perfect hedge than does the 1-1-1 spread. All right, so that's going to do it for Chapter 13. We've covered how to construct the soybean crush spread and how to follow those prices over time, and when we might expect to see profitability going up, when we might expect to see profitability going down. If you're interested in this market, there's a really nice publication linked here that was prepared by the United Soybean Board about how the global oilseed grain trade works. It's really nicely put together, so I recommend you take a look at that if you're interested. Otherwise, I'll see you guys later.